Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelance writer, player of games, writer of words, recorder of videos, and tabletop role-playing aficionado. Welcome to another DM's Guild review, my written and video view series. We'll take a look at the adventures and supplemental material at the Dungeon Masters Guild website. This video, I'll be reviewing the level 1 adventure, The Slithering Brood, designed by Dylan Hyatt for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Review copy has been provided for the purposes of this review. If you enjoy my videos, consider using my affiliate links for your online shopping, supporting me via patreon.com/Rogue Watson. Shoutouts to Platinum patrons Joe, Will, Tiny Dancer, Manuel, Wizard Princess, Christopher, Star Loverly, Thomas, L-Dogs92, Ian, James, and Captain Mike. And gold patrons RPG Papercrafts, Charming Grenade, Pretty Boy, and Yuma, Marcos, Dave, Vicente, Gilberto, Adam, Deathers and Lounge, Sam, Arash, Lumpy Spuds, Jerome, Fatboy619, Sclinny Nick, and Party McButterpants. Thank you all very much for your support. We've got another level 1 adventure here, and I have actually reviewed 2 of this designer's previous adventures, and strangely enough, this one actually, from what I can tell, takes place between those 2 adventures. The first one was called Gloria's Gambit, which actually takes place in the same village that this adventure is set in. And the other one is the Sunken Village of Little Korth, which I think was actually the first adventure that I reviewed from the designer. So a little bit confusing chronologically. Technically, these adventures all take place within the designer's own custom campaign that's supposed to span a number of adventures, but they're all released a la carte, so you can connect them all if you want, or you could just pick and choose any one of the adventures to run. I will take umbrage with the fact that this is a level 1 adventure, and it's the second one in the series, which means the designer expects you to play through an entire first adventure at level 1 and not level up the players, and then get them to this adventure, and then they're still level 1. That sucks. I would always say, if you're going to do level 1, you can do that if you want. I still think it's more of a tutorial than anything else. But you need to immediately level your players up after, ideally, 1 session, maybe 2 sessions, which is usually the scope of a single level 1 adventure. So I would certainly not want to keep them at level 1 for multiple adventures. But again, you could just run this as your own level 1 adventure. You could comfortably ignore the other one. The storylines are different. It just happens to take place within the same town. It just has its own storyline. And the overarching campaign, you can also ignore if you want. It has to do with a bunch of different evil cults and things. The adventure itself, the advantages and disadvantages are actually kind of the same from when I reviewed the designer's previous adventures, in that I generally like the stories that have been crafted, and I generally dislike the actual layout and look of the product itself, including just the maps and the fonts and all that kind of thing. So I guess the important part, the actual content, I think is pretty good. And the stuff that might be a barrier of entry, which is how it actually looks to read and all that, and how to parse that information, is not so good. I think the designer is improving along the way, but largely I think they have used the same kind of color schemes and formatting and whatever tools, and that's the style that they seem to be using and enjoy, and it's not one that I like to look at. This one, unlike the other adventures, from what I can recall, this one is not a dungeon crawl. It is a murder mystery, a missing persons mystery, I guess, that takes place in the village of Ditch Nettle, which is also the location of the other adventure, Gloria's Gambit. Whereas that one was a dungeon crawl, this one, there's a bunch of missing townsfolk that you have to investigate. And the adventure is basically divided up between part 1, which is more of an adventure background that you would see in other adventures. Usually they have just an introduction section, and then they go part 1, part 2, part 3. This one, part 1, is basically that introductory section. It talks about the entire background, and you can see there's pages and pages of information here in terms of what has happened, who's behind it all, what are the individual disappearances that have occurred. And funny enough, one of the disappearances is actually doesn't have anything to do with the main plot villain, who is this evil jester who's been, it turns out to be a cultist of the Brood goddess, and is trying to basically still convince people to go to this cave because he's telling people there's gold there, and then sacrificing them to a bunch of giant worms, as you do. There's actually another person who's been murdered that just happens to be part of like a land dispute by some rival farmers, which is actually expanded into this whole subplot that I thought was kind of more interesting and enjoyable than the actual main quest. There's this whole like political thing you can get into where like the villain is trying to like take control of the town and then oust the PCs from the area and stop their investigation. We don't need outsiders here. The designer does a good job of painting this as kind of a small town feel with all that entails, and then you come in as kind of the outside investigators to try to figure out what's going on. And it so happens that one of the missing people is the sheriff, who has been accidentally killed by one of these other farmers who's having a rivalry dispute with another farmer. And I don't know if I go into all the details, but that guy was actually the one he was having the rivalry with, ends up being lured away and killed by the evil jester cultist guy. But meanwhile, a sheriff was coming to like put a stop to the dispute, and then one of the other farmers like kind of accidentally like shoots the sheriff, and then hides the body in the other guy's like farm, and it's this whole thing. And I thought it was actually a really interesting subplot, and it just felt very realistic in a refreshing way for D&D. And then happens to be there's this kind of evil jester luring people away to sacrifice them to giant worms, which is basically definitely a more D&D plot. But I thought the actual farmer plot was a little more interesting than all of that. The way it's organized is, I was a little turned off at first because we don't have that classic like Act 1, here's the person giving you the quest and here's what we need you to do, here's the information. Instead, you just, as the DM, you're just given all this information, and then it's this little, almost just matter-of-fact paragraph that, under this getting started section here, that is actually serves as the introduction to the entire adventure. So the adventure kicks off when the party enters Ditch Nettle. The PCs learn the Sheriff Vornhelm went missing the night before, which is the actual sheriff who's been accidentally murdered, and his body has been hidden and all that. The sheriff's brother is offering the players gold to help locate the missing brother, as well as other missing villagers, which again is unrelated, but then you'll find out both plots. And that's the whole kickoff, and then away you go. So you're it feels like we're missing like a page here of getting that information, having like, because usually you get like a sidebar that's actual like in-universe dialogue and information to kick the story off, but instead it's just kind of a matter of fact for the DM to kind of try and get and convey all that information to the players. And then part 2 is investigating, going around this town and then talking to all the townsfolk. As you can see, the art style here is a little different. I don't actually mind the kind of 3D cartoon rendition of the different areas. Unfortunately, the battle maps are, well, here's an example, is a very, very odd style where I appreciate that it's kind of in color, but it's still it's a graph paper art style with some color and detail on it. And I don't know. There's one, let's see, later on that looks, okay, here's an example where you can see like chairs and crates and things. And like it's got this kind of iconography where the V's are windows. It's a half system between that kind of abstract, Dice and Logos-esque black and white style and then a full color detail map. It's somewhere in between, but it doesn't quite look good. I think I like it better than the Dice and Logos style, but it's still not obviously something I would put on a virtual tabletop. But I guess I appreciate that we are given some maps, and they are included in a separate zip file, so you can actually use these maps as handouts or in a virtual tabletop, although I would probably choose to not use them. You can see as I'm flipping through here with the kind of the problem I have with the layout. There's a lot of big chunks of text without paragraph breaks. One thing I really hate is the designer just seems to use all kinds of colors without any real sense of style for them. Like, we have a sidebar that's in this dark purple, a sidebar that's in this really, really bright orange. There's a heading here that's got a blue background. The subheadings have red, it's highlighted yellow. I actually like the way the question and answer looks, and that's one of my pros for this adventure, is when you go on the investigation, a lot of times you'll get the, in these kind of mystery adventures, you'll get the information on each NPC and what they know and what they're going to share with the players, which is good information. But we don't usually get a full-on like dialogue breakdown of how that character would respond to sample questions. And the designer does that here, which is really, really cool. That, to me, that's like above and beyond when it comes to handling each scene with these important characters that the party would most likely want to interact with because they are the important people. It'd be like the wife of a missing person or the best friend of a missing person or somebody that knows information that they would go to. So there's a couple of these that have multiple questions and answers, basically assuming the players would ask questions close to what these are, and then you can respond with these actual in-universe answers, which is really cool. I think that's very, very nice. There's an incredibly, way overly complicated puzzle here, which it's a fun visual, but and it's almost it's a side thing too. The players can explore like this ancient Netherese villa that they happen to be staying at, and they'll discover this what amounts to a game of chutes and ladders with like a giant dice that's got certain rules where you can only use so many facings, and there's a figure that moves along the board, but there are certain rules with how they move. It's if your puzzle takes more than a full page to explain, it's probably too complicated for D&D. Like, I can appreciate some really interesting, cool puzzle designs, but anytime, in fact, if you literally design a puzzle with red herrings included, I think you've done a bad job because you'll immediately start confusing the crap out of your players. It's very, very tricky to design puzzles. I'm trying to go off a rant here for D&D because if you make them too hard, you're immediately frustrating your players. And if you make them too easy, then it's almost not even a puzzle. It's like, okay, we did the thing. So I realize it's very difficult, but this thing is literally like 3 pages long to describe. And it starts off promising. Like it's almost like a board game of playing chutes and ladders, like Solo, where you have to roll a dice and figure out the movement. But there's this weird rule where like it moves ahead so many spaces depending on what row it's at. And it's supposed to like trick the players up so they don't realize that's happening. The penalty is this awful curse that you can be cursed with, I guess, where you can go berserk if you take damage, and it's horrible. And I can't see the players figuring this one out without a lot of trial and error. So I think it's a neat idea, but it's way too overly complicated for what it is. But I like the idea of like a board game with dice used as a form of doing a puzzle, but this takes way too long to explain and get through. And ultimately, like I said, if your puzzle takes 3 pages, it's probably a little bit too complicated. But I like the non-linear approach to the way this investigation is handled, which is there is no real set of clues or things the players have to get that lead them from one thing to another. It's more about gathering evidence and clues implicating, ideally, that Jester character as the one behind a lot of the disappearances. But at the same time, I mean, I guess the main plot has a red herring in itself, which is there's that other body that they can find, the sheriff who was killed, and that actually doesn't have anything to do with the main plot. And in fact, that's, to me, I think that's the more interesting result, which is in part 3. So once you've gone around and you've talked to all these different people in town, part 3 includes all the scripted events that can occur, which includes finding the corpse of the sheriff, as well as the killer organizing a town moot to try to basically take control of the town to, partially protect himself, but oust the sheriff's brother as the de facto sheriff, I guess, and as well as ban the outside players because obviously they don't the player characters because he doesn't want the players to discover the body and all this. That I think is a really, really cool turn of events, and if handled well, could be a really interesting side plot that puts the whole investigation into peril. And thankfully in part 2, there's a whole section where if the players go to his farm, things can change a lot depending on if he is openly hostile to the players or not. And you can really choose to, run that moot beforehand to allow the players to meet him and implicate him. Maybe he retreats to the villa, or maybe he wins over the townsfolk and then the players are in trouble. Now they have to kind of sneak around and do things. It could really change things up, and I appreciate the designer seems to allow for that to happen, because a lot of times when you've got these, relatively short, this adventure is actually about 50 pages long, but it's still relatively short. It's just a lot of information given, a lot of detailed information given to how the investigation runs. I mean, you saw that one puzzle was 3 pages long. But I appreciate that a lot of attention is paid to how things can change depending on the order, depending on the information the players have gathered and the order in which they tackle these various events and how they handle that whole subplot with the killer farmer, whether they find the body or not. They can discover, he was killed with a crossbow bolt, not a bow, which would definitely implicate the right murderer if they end up in his house and can end up searching it and find that he's got a crossbow hidden on the hanging on the wall, and he's a fan of that. Whereas the guy who he tried to frame as the murderer is a big bow hunter and is very much against crossbows as for pansies and mechanical people that don't want to hunt with bows and all this. That whole thing is done really, really well to where once we got to the actual, and then back to the main quest, and then this evil jester kidnaps the barmaid, and that's the big climax. It felt kind of underwhelming in a weird way. I think the designer had a really cool plot set up where it was almost just more of a, almost mundane, but I kind of liked that. And plus we're level 1, and I feel like if there's a time to deal with more not mundane, I mean it's still a devious subplot, but it's a kind of that you would see on like a serialized television show rather than like a fantasy story, for example. And that was working really well for me. I thought it was well written and well designed, and those characters were interesting, versus this evil jester who's just kidnapping people, and it's kind of a goofy character in general. Kidnapping people and then dragging them to this cave that is just not that far from town and happens to include this giant pit with an evil statue there and a bunch of slithering giant worms. Like, how is this so close to the town and they haven't found this yet? And that equates to the climax where the players can save this poor bound barmaid from being the final sacrifice that awakens Morolowski. Which, weirdly enough, so the adventure does a good job of explaining different outcomes and changes that can happen depending on the order the players tackle things and if they happen to do this or that. But then there's a weird kind of plot hole where the adventure allows the players to defeat Castor is his name, the jester Castor, early in the adventure, or relatively early, at least prevent him from even getting here. But then it mentions the fact that the players should still show up here and deal with this event, hopefully learn about its existence and all that, and shut this like sacrificial altar cave thing down. But then I don't think the climax is actually running as written, because the climax is the fact that the jester has kidnapped this barmaid character and is sacrificing her. So if he's already been defeated, then obviously she's not going to be there unless you're doing some weird DM fiat where she was captured before. And I don't know. There's not. In other words, the designer kind of runs out of ways to get around the players getting around things, and just seems to say, well, Castor might have been defeated, but it still assumes the barmaid has been kidnapped and is about to be sacrificed. So I thought that was a little bit of a weird thing at the end. But otherwise, I don't like the way that it looks, but I still actually do kind of like this adventure. It does have the Dramatis Personae in the form of an appendix at the end where it talks about all the important characters. It doesn't quite have the fun, in-depth notes about maybe what they know and what they would share, which I think which other mystery adventures that I've reviewed have done. But to me, it kind of makes up for it by including the literal question and answer for all the NPCs that you could interview, which I really do enjoy that. And then there's a final appendix where, if you wanted to, you could run this overarching campaign from the designer, which is called the Orbs of the Plains. 40 adventures, taking the PCs up to 20th level. So that's a lot, and you can see why it takes 40 adventures, because like the first 2 are level 1, which is Glorious Gambit and this one. And if you wanted to do that, you could. There's a lot of information there. There's some NPCs that are tied together. There's a lot of plot points. And if you've seen some sidebars that have been going around, some of the sidebars specifically point to things that have happened in the previous adventure because they took place in the same town. So, for example, whether you did the adventure or not might determine if the villains are still under custody or not. So that's kind of a cool, cinematic universe, shared universe thing you could do if you wanted to run those together. But on the other hand, you can totally ignore that and it doesn't change a damn thing, which I think is a good way to run a big campaign, is do the a la carte thing and just, hey, here's the piecemeal. We're going to cut it up in terms of different adventures that you could run apart from the campaign, or you could string them together and run them all together. All right, let's go over my pros and cons for the Slithering Brood. Pro, written questions and answers when interrogating each NPC. That is a really cool thing. I love to see that really in any adventure. If there's ever a chance to talk to characters, to me, like obviously having the role-playing notes is good, which this one does provide, but having literally dialogue that character would say could certainly help. And some DMs are better at DMing dialogue than others, but especially in a mystery-focused adventure, when players will absolutely be chatting. I mean, that's the thing they need to do, is they need to be searching for clues, investigating, certain areas, and talking with people and getting information out of them. And the fact that that information is already given in a question and answer format is actually extremely helpful. Pro, a non-linear approach to investigation as well as scripted events around the village. So part 2 is just purely organized by location. The players could technically investigate any of these things under any order that they want. They're not under any obligation to do any certain kind of order, but here's all the different places they can go and what they can learn. And then in part 3, part 3 happens concurrently with part 2. It's just, hey, here are certain events you can trigger at certain times whenever you feel like they would work bad. And one of them is just like, hey, you can unleash a giant slug on near the party, because that's what the whole evil cult guy's doing, is raising up these slugs and stuff. So I think it breaks up the action pretty nicely and creates a lot of fun things for the players to do while still running the whole investigation sequence. So that works really well. And Pro, I did think that the ability to tie this together with previous adventures that the designer has created is pretty cool. So the optional sidebar is an expanded appendix for connecting the adventure to the designer's overarching multi-adventure campaign, particularly with the previous one, Gloria's Gambit, because it takes place in the exact same town. So there's a lot of neat little connections to that. Cons: the side plots of the farmer feud, the murder, and the subsequent possible political upheaval to the entire town, I found way more interesting than the actual main plot of the evil jester kidnapping people and sacrificing them to his god. I think, honestly, that would have been a way more interesting aspect, is if it turns out maybe the farmer ends up being even going further down the evil line, and maybe he was being corrupted, or maybe he's in league with somebody, or maybe the jester's blaming it on the farm. It would have, some kind of better connection there would have been more interesting to me. I just think that was not necessarily a wasted opportunity, because it is expanded quite a bit, but it just almost, I guess the problem is the main quest isn't interesting enough to reach that level that side plot is. So I thought that side plot one was actually particularly good, and unfortunately it made the actual main quest seem kind of underwhelming by comparison. The other con is that I still find the designer is using a unattractive layout that I am just not a fan of. Just a lot of weird color choices and big blocks of text, and the art style doesn't really speak to me. All of that I'm just including as a general con, kind of wrapped up together, but just not a fan of the way the product necessarily looks, with the caveat that I think every one that I've reviewed of theirs has improved, I think, but ultimately I'm still not a fan of the actual physical look of the product itself. Final verdict: though the main story is overshadowed by a more interesting subplot of rivalry and murder, the Slithering Brood provides an intriguing, mystery-focused level 1 adventure with a small town feel. Thank you to everyone for watching this video review. You can see my written review at roguewatson.com. You can support my work at patreon.com/roguewatson, and you can follow our own D&D adventures here on my YouTube channel. Thank you.